Another friend from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, is recognized for any questions she cares to pose.
Thank you. As I hope this discussion has demonstrated, immigration and border security are pretty complex issues, and as such, they require nuanced and comprehensive solutions. Unfortunately, neither of those terms describes H.R. 2. It's pretty clear that our colleagues don't actually want to promote meaningful reforms that are required to secure the border or fix our broken immigration system. Instead, we've got a completely unworkable bill, and without any real solutions, we have instead inflammatory rhetoric, conspiracy theories, and political fear designed to stoke fear and chaos. We saw how the failed and inhumane immigration policies of the previous administration weakened our economy, undermined our moral standing in the world, inflicted permanent harm on migrant children and their families, and didn't make us any safer. H.R. 2 would waste American taxpayer dollars building a border wall that experts have testified time and time again will not solve our border issues. Instead, we should be investing in infrastructure at the ports of entry, where 90% of fentanyl and illicit drug smuggling is actually happening. And most troubling of all, this legislation puts children in harm's way, even as our colleagues claim that they want to protect children. It opens the door to jailing kids indefinitely, bars them from seeking asylum, and denies them access to representation that they need to navigate our complicated immigration system. During my legal career, I spent decades working on immigration cases, and I know the system is broken, but I also understand the realities many of those arriving at our border face. I represented kids and other asylum seekers who come to the U.S. to flee gang activity, political violence, abuse, starvation, trafficking, and other exploitation. People risk their lives to come here because the situation in their home countries is so horrific. For all of those reasons, these conditions have been building for decades. This bill does nothing to address those conditions. During markup in judiciary and again today, our colleagues have tried to justify provisions that would endanger and inflict harm on migrant children by saying they wanted to send them safely home, ignoring the fact that the whole reason they migrated was because home was not safe. And in many cases, home didn't exist. These kids were orphans. Their families had already migrated. So, we need to recognize both the conditions that people are fleeing and the meaningful contributions that immigrants make to our country. We benefit from the talent and tax dollars that result from functioning pathways for work in immigration. We need doctors, care workers, agricultural workers, researchers, and more to make our economy work. We need the tax dollars from younger workers to keep our Social Security system solvent. So it's to all of our benefit to provide functioning pathways for people to enter the U.S. lawfully. This bill does nothing to fix our immigration system, so I deeply oppose its passage out of committee. Ranking Member Nadler, I think you had something you wanted to add.
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to comment on what Chairman McCall said about that New York Times report. 85,000 children are not lost. Once HHS releases children to their sponsors, part of their post-release services are a follow-up phone call. If 3 phone calls go unanswered, the children are marked as unreachable on a spreadsheet. I don't know that any of us answer every unknown phone call we receive. The same situation happened under the Trump administration, and Obama's DPC director provided the same explanation.
Thank you. And I know from experience with representing kids in this situation, they are most often released to custody of a relative. So,
Yes.
Should we have more services to address the needs of migrant children, social services, representation? Absolutely. But I'm afraid the 85,000 talking point is, as some would call it, malarkey. Representative Thompson, was there something you wanted to add?
Yes, and thank the chair for allowing me to sit. For the most part, I've heard the comments, and I'd just like for the record to reflect that the bill we're talking about today and the section pertaining to Homeland, there was nothing about unaccompanied children in it. So it's that part that I think that we need to understand. Our committee spent those 16-plus hours, and there was nothing about unaccompanied children in the bill. As important is we offered a good number of amendments that we thought should have been considered. Not a single Democratic amendment was accepted. We wanted to increase the number of people working at the border. That was turned down. We wanted to level the pay of people working at the border. That was turned down. A number of efforts to make the climate of the employees better because there are people working side by side in many instances who are federal employees who are making different salaries for the most part doing similar work. So I look forward to the chairman going forward with this bipartisan effort. It's just that it didn't manifest itself in this bill. We got it 15 minutes before the deadline to consider, and we'll look forward to the bipartisanship that we have historically had in this committee, and that this bill is a radical departure from that bipartisanship.
Thank you. I think we did see the parts about the unaccompanied minors in the judiciary markup, and we only went for about 15 hours, so you worked harder than we did. But we similarly offered dozens of amendments which were not accepted. The part about unaccompanied minor children was particularly troubling given how vulnerable these kids are. And if they're going to be incarcerated, as suggested by the bill, then clearly Homeland Security has to deal with where they are placed. I mean, what this bill does do is probably a huge boon for the private prison industry, which will reap untold benefits from all the incarceration that is proposed by this bill. Not something I would recommend.
Well, you know, we keep them for 72 hours, and after that, the law says we have to pass them on. And that becomes the burden of HHS. Mm-hmm. So DHS is out of the business in short order, and all of what's being discussed about children becomes a function of HHS, not DHS.
I think that's under the Flores decision, but this bill, as introduced, will gut the Flores decision.
That's right.
So that's one of the big objections to it. I think at this point I'd yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to my good friend, the distinguished Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take, before we get to the business of the day, probably within the last hour, that meeting down at the White House has wrapped up, and I don't know how it turned out or what to expect on the discussions of the debt limit, but I do know this, Mr. Chairman. Without your stewardship of getting that bill, the Limit, Save, and Grow bill, through the Rules Committee and onto the floor, they wouldn't be having that discussion. Amen. So incredibly important to get that bill passed 2 weeks ago. That gives me optimism that H.R. 1, having such a good position now in getting the debt limit discussions going, H.R. 2 can perhaps have an equal amount of gas in the tank for getting a border security bill or border security under discussion. Mr. Jordan, I don't want to imply that I wasn't listening, but maybe I wasn't listening as carefully as I should have been as you started your remarks. You gave us a recitation of some numbers of what this country has seen in the last 2.5 years.
Yeah, but just the last weekend, 26,072 hours in one sector in Texas. So 5 million over the 28 months of the Biden administration. So you could go on and on. But the big number.
Let me just stop you there. 5 million over the months of the Biden administration. Mm-hmm. Is anyone aware of a comparable situation in any country where 5 million people in 2 years and a little more have been infused into the population? I mean, and that's on top of, we normally take in what, 1.1 million people legally each year?
Yeah. Yep, and I will tell you, but one of the sheriffs who testified at a hearing, he said 28 years of law enforcement, he's a sheriff on the border in Arizona. He said he's never seen it this bad. In 28 years, he's never seen it this bad. And frankly, he said in the previous administration, it was as good as he's ever seen it. So in 28 years of law enforcement on our southern border, he says right now it's as bad as it's ever been.
Bad or worse. And then here is the problem and why it is so critically important that people see a seriousness about a border security bill. In 48 hours, what has been untenable may become astonishing in its level.
Good point.
And we've seen the drone pictures of people that are sort of waiting their time to, because of this notion that when Title 42 expires, there really will be no limits on the amount of people that can come into this country. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the one other thing, when you have that volume of folks coming across the border, coming into our nation, there are going to be some bad people. And we know of 200 on the terrorist watch list. And never forget, a year ago when Secretary Mayorkas was in front of the Judiciary Committee, we asked him a question. At the time, it was only 42, I believe. Now it's 200. At the time, 42, we said, what is the status of those individuals? And you may remember his answer, because everyone watching remembered. He said, I don't know. He didn't know if they were detained. He didn't know where they're. And you're coming in front of the Judiciary Committee as the Secretary of Homeland Security, security of the nation. You should know the status of the 42 individuals who are on the terrorist watch list, and he didn't. And now that number is 5 times what it was at the time that he testified.
So one of the other things that's being discussed currently down on the border is will be the inability of the NGOs to handle the number of people that are dropped off at their locations. Now, historically, I mean, multiple trips down to McAllen, I've seen it over and over and over again where a notice to appear is given and the folks are dropped off at Sacred Heart Church in downtown McAllen. They're given a fanny pack with a bottle of water and a bus ticket, and good luck to you. But now those NGOs will be overwhelmed. Catholic Charities will be overwhelmed. And basically, people will just be turned loose on the street corners and hope to catch a bus somewhere. Has there been any discussion, either in Judiciary or Homeland Security, about how that's going to be handled? What's going to be the mechanism of control on the streets of those border communities? Either one of you.
No, you used the right word, Doctor. The word is overwhelmed, and that's what's happening. And now the Biden administration is talking about, and Secretary Marks is talking about.
If I could, they're overwhelmed now.
Yeah.
In 48 hours,
it'd be
in
worse.
a week's time, it's going to be astonishing at the level.
The president did act, he is sending 1,500 military down there to process. But again, what
Yeah,
the
and let me
president,
interrupt you there.
Yeah.
And my governor said 1,500. And these are people with pencils in their hand to.
that's correct.
to
They're
take
there
notes.
to process people. They're not there to stop anyone. And that just encourages more.
And that number should be 15,000 or 50,000 with enforcement capabilities. Instead, these are clerical
They're
personnel.
processors, yes.
So,
Add to the incentive.
yeah, and really that's what's so worrisome. And Mr. Jordan, Chairman Jordan, you referenced a term that a lot of people may not be familiar with, and we know from past experience there are so many people that hang on the televised Rules Committee hearings. Like, can you explain the Darien Gap to people who might not know?
It's in Panama. It's where they come through, and it's and they're already massing there. So and we've all seen the caravans of folks coming. And look, we all say we don't fault anyone for wanting to get to the greatest country ever, but you got to do it legally. You got to do it the right way, and you got to have an administration that understands that. And this one doesn't.
But the Darien Gap is that area of real estate that exists south of Panama, between Panama,
Yep.
the Isthmus of Panama, and South America. But it is also some of the most ungoverned and lawless and dangerous real estate
Yep.
on the face of the earth. Is that not correct?
Yeah, we've had. I've not been there personally, but we've had members go down there and see for themselves. I think Chairman Green has been there, but yeah, that's what we're talking about. And their estimates are now thousands are already massing there to make the trek and the burdensome and troublesome trek for north.
Well, again, the policies and what this administration has followed has only exacerbated the problem, and it's fixing to get worse on a level that I don't think anyone really can adequately anticipate. I also, Mr. Chairman, I had some, we heard about the New York Times article. I have a second New York Times article I'd like to submit for the record. My migrant children were put to work, and the United States ignored the warnings. And Mr. Thompson is exactly correct. 3 days.
Without objection.
3 days after, or after 72 hours, those children are turned over to the Department of Health and Human Services. And the issue there has been the throughput then became so critical. Get those kids in and get them out quickly. And you heard references to Secretary Becerra saying this could be a Henry Ford type assembly line. In this article from the New York Times, Susan Rice is quoted as saying, this is BS. These kids are coming here just because they're, this is BS, Mrs. Rice wrote. What is leading to voluntary separation is our generosity to unaccompanied children. I mean, that is pretty harsh. And that is in this administration. That was a domestic policy advisor until a week and a half ago in this administration. So I do want this to be made part of the record. And then as part of a hearing that we held in the Oversight Investigations on Energy and Commerce, which does have jurisdiction over the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the Inspector General came into that hearing, and they had prepared a report from the, and I would also like to submit for the record the Office of Inspector General operational challenges within ORR and the ORR emergency intake site at Fort Bliss hindered case management for children.
Without objection.
So on page 15 of this report, headline is the Office of Refugee Resettlement issued field guidance that removes certain steps of the sponsor screening process across ORR facilities, potentially increasing children's risk of release to unsafe sponsors. Subparagraph, according to federal field specialist supervisors, some ORR field guidance issued from March of 2021 through June of 2021 was developed without adequate input from ORR staff with expertise in child welfare. Well, let me translate that for you. Originally, ORR could only release children in their custody to family members or close relatives after appropriate vetting. But they changed the guidance. It was a field guidance that was issued in March of 2021 where they didn't need to take those protective steps anymore. So I actually believe, Chairman McCall, that 85,000 number that you referenced, when we actually know that number is going to be significantly higher because Secretary Mayorkas unilaterally changed by field guidance, not something that went through the Administrative Procedures Act, certainly not something that came through a legislative committee in regular order, but by field guidance said, we don't need to do this work anymore, and we can send these kids wherever the heck it is we want. And that is what has led to the crisis that the New York Times has published these articles. We have to have a secure border. After we have a secure border, we can talk about any number of immigration reforms any one of us would like to see, but we do not have a secure border. And in fact, the border is becoming less secure by the hour, and over these next 48 hours, again, I submit we are going to see a crisis of really, really unheralded proportions. So again, Mr. Chairman, I do want to ask that both of these articles.
Doctor, can I respond to that?
Yes,
Because I have
would
to say,
you
this is what worries me. These children that come in are being sent to stash houses, essentially. And I've lived this for a long time, but this is the worst. And so they're not vetted. The sponsors aren't vetted properly. You got 10, maybe 20 kids going to the same house. This is not a mom and pop thing, not a mom and pop shop, really. It's a trafficking organization that's happening inside this country right now. And it's the children that are being affected by this policy.
And if I recall correctly, it was the Houston Chief of Police that said, not to Homeland Security, but ORR, you're releasing all of these children to the same address, and you don't even know where that is. And there was no vetting of the process. And Secretary Mayorkas issued field guidance, not going through normal administrative procedures, not going through the legislative branch. Here's the field guidance. We can just kind of send them wherever we want. And that is nuts. And we're asking for trouble. We're asking for more disasters. But as bad as it is today, a week from now, there's no telling what the numbers are that we're going to see. We all know they're going up. They're high now, but they're going to get higher, and more people are going to be hurt. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.